Yes, we are now live, and
Oh,
welcome back
awesome.
to the Outcast Intellectual Podcast that always has a non-awkward beginning because, whatever. It
It's
does the,
perfect.
you may know this because you've probably, oh man, and the second we start, uh, good old Cowboy Robert is like the first one on, and uh-oh, good stuff coming. Yeah,
No, good old
even
Robert, man.
even when it's a podcast episode, if Lauren's involved, you know that
I was
it's
just thinking
immediately going to
about
be good.
him. He's a good guy. He's
Yeah.
he's hilarious. I love him, man. I hope to see him around some. Maybe I'll reach out to him after this is over. See what he's up to.
Yeah, maybe, man. I mean, he knows you. He knows the intents there. So who knows? Maybe he'll
Yeah,
message you during the thing. He's done it to me before.
good guy.
um,
I'm not checking Facebook, so I'll see it after.
gotcha. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I thought that for this one, uh, Lauren, I know that you probably caught a little bit before of like little bits and pieces of episodes, but one of the things that I like doing on um, on the podcast. Sorry, Robert was saying Austin in a few weeks. So yeah, I think you guys will see each other at the event.
Awesome.
Um, awesome in Austin, and I like having like conversations that I wish more people were having in the spirit that they were having them. And so, for example, like I mean, I'm vegetarian, but I'm also like when it comes to the whole like the animal loving thing, like yeah, that does extend taunting and stuff like that. And that is why I wanted to talk to my buddy Maddie, who is a bow hunter,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to like know like where he comes from with it. And like it was a great conversation, it's respectful the entire time, and that's like the kind of conversation I like to be able to have in the modern day when it seems like if you don't believe exactly what I say, you're mentally disabled or something, or whatever
Mm-hmm.
else. And
Yeah.
so, and one thing that I don't think I really hear about like very often, which is common because it seems like all news is negative these days, um, is like people of faith in the modern day.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that like ever since I met you, you've done like a lot to help me out. You've always been, nice. You've always been kind to everybody that I've seen you around. And you contrast that with the people on the news where it's like, someone's like
Mm-hmm.
screaming at a person who's, going into Planned Parenthood, like trying to tell them how they're gonna like burn forever and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like the contrast. So I guess like before I get into like all the big topical stuff, like I know that like plays a huge part in your life.
Mm-hmm.
How um I guess like kind of like what's your, I'm not gonna say your background, like what's your background in being
Yeah,
religious, like
my CV, right?
right. Yeah, so it's like why does it have so much meaning to you? I mean, I'm sure you were raised with it as well, but like why does it mean so much to you?
Yeah, man, that's a good question. So, I mean, I was raised in the church, but I think as everyone, you get older, you begin to start to question things and start to want to have your life, right? And your faith and your belief, whatever that is, it's you want to own that. So you start to not necessarily in a mean, derisive way question everything, but in more like, hey, this is kind of what I've always believed to be true, and you, there are other possibilities out there, like what is actually true. And
Mm-hmm.
so all throughout, in eighth grade, I came to faith, and then was baptized. And at that point, I think one of the greatest evidences, in my opinion, of the evidence of Satan is how people who make a profession of faith, now they have a bullseye on their back, and that was kind of me throughout high school.
Okay.
Just temptations that I had before, like it was almost like I started having a lot of temptations that I'd never had to deal with before, and so went through kind of a period of wrestling and struggling with that all throughout.
As a teenager.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy hard. It is true. It is true, right?
Right.
And throughout my teenage years, though, it was kind of like whenever I'd go through a bad time, it was like you look back, it's like I had friend troubles. I had girl troubles. I mean, it's lame stuff. Like now as like a 41-year-old, you look back, you're like, Psh, that was like nothing. But at the time, I mean,
It's
this
the
is
end of the
like,
world. Yeah.
yeah, it's so, and I remember anytime I would go through these struggles, whether it was grades or, you know, whatever teenage struggles I had, it was always that comfort of, you know, scripture and that comfort of faith that I kind of was drawn back into, that kind of made sense of things again. And in college, I went through a real interesting time, where I went through a period of time where I felt horrible. I felt, I don't know if it was like clinical depression or what, but I just, I had this feeling of loneliness and just emptiness. And the weird thing was, if you would have looked at me from the outside, you would have thought I had like everything together, because I was a good kid. I mean, I was popular. I like made good grades. Like I had a full scholarship. I had everything going for me, and there was nothing that I could point to like this is a problem. It was like everything if everything's lining up, like I should be happy, but there was just something missing. There was just this emptiness. And so that was another period of searching. I'd always done searching. I was one of these weird kids who would like go to the lunchroom and like read like Greek philosophy and stuff like that when other people were, I don't know, like trading Pokemon cards or whatever, right?
Now,
We were
don't
talking
you
about
start
that.
talking
Yeah,
down talking the cards.
we were talking about that earlier, right? But in this so in college, when I went through this time, I went through just this another this other intense kind of period of searching and trying to make sense of the world, and was reading you know, a lot of books, and it just hit me that the God of the universe wanted a personal relationship with me. And there was something that I had heard, but it hit me almost as if I'd never heard it before. And all of a sudden, like I saw what I, you know, believed to be true, that I was a sinner and that I was destined for hell, and that Christ came to live and a perfect life and die in my place, so that his righteousness can now be, you know, imputed on me, and he can accept the punishment for my sins that should have been mine. And trusting in him, it was like all of that took on like a fresh light, and I saw that the love of God, that he, you know, desired that relationship with me. He gave me the Bible so that I could know about him. He's blessed me with a church and blessed me with people who would tell me the truth, and just the many ways that he has reached out to me, like calling me to himself. It just became like so beautiful and so real to me that it's like it clicked. You know, it was like life made sense at that moment in a way where it hadn't been in the previous few, you know, months and maybe years of that searching. And so it became very real to me. It always was, but it was kind of this elevated level of, this is what, you know, this is my life, right? This is real to me. And so I live from that. So you mentioned like how it affects my life. I mean, it is my life. It is the core foundation of everything. At that point, I started maybe with I started kind of really wanting to read more of the Bible and pursue more of the things of God, and kind of reoriented my perspective to, instead of chasing what the world says to chase what, you know, what God says to. And I kind of calibrated where all of a sudden dating was no longer about let's just have fun, let's just, you know, go have a relationship with a pretty girl or whatever, socialize. It was like, I'm looking for a spouse. Now, part of that was because I was that age anyway. I was, you know, 21, 22 years old. And but I definitely all of a sudden now valued a woman being a Christian as kind of like my primary, like non-negotiable. So met my wife several months after that. And interestingly, she had kind of gone through a similar period where she had kind of really, you know, dedicated herself to finding someone who loved, you know, God as well. So we got married, and so our mutual faith was the foundation of our marriage, and brought us, you know, close together. So together we've been just, I mean, that was almost 18 years ago. I'm super old to talk about that. Wow. But that's just been the foundation of my life. And whether it was career or you know, family, marriage, whatever came my way, it always was navigated from the foundation of faith first, which, you know, has put me in some sticky situations where I've had to kind of navigate as, you know, a Christian in a world sometimes that it doesn't take unkindly to Christians, I would say, but sometimes situations are presented where you have to kind of make unpopular and abnormal decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is largely a case of being like guilty by association, right? Because it's like there are people out there, and this is like when people like when I describe like the way that I look at things to people, one of the ways that I usually find myself describing is like because I am uh, definitely on the other end of things when it comes to like my beliefs, but at the same time, I would much rather spend time with a person I consider to be good, who, we see things completely differently, versus someone who may technically believe what I believe, but
Mm-hmm.
it's just like that, like rage, the raging atheist like stereotype as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, because like I don't care if we believe in the same thing. I care if we are the same kind of person, if that makes sense. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And I think it's just like how it's like people who want to look at like only like the negative elements of I'm gonna say religion, because I think that religion versus faith is like an important distinction to make, particularly since religion can also be like an organizational body, right? And as we know, people have misused religion in the past as well. So I think people who want a simple answer, they will see it's like religion is imperfect, therefore all people who, you know are religious, have faith, whatever, they're just this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, lots of people like writing other things off as the simple situation so they don't need to think about it. And when you have the people who are, they're going out of their way to, scream at people getting abortions, and, they're literally just, they're trying to say how like you're gonna burn forever. Like they're going out of their way to just be as negative as possible. And then you have someone who's looking at that, who's only focusing on the negative. Now everybody who believes anything similar to what that person believes, even if just that there is a God, now they're just like that person. You know what I mean? So I can see how not being that person in a world where like there is that kind of the stereotype in some ways, could be really difficult.
Yeah, and I think honestly, a lot of that, I think that there's a very, very, very vocal minority,
Yeah.
a very tiny minority that honestly it's never even been that big of a deal to me. Like I've never seen it that way. I think that it's unusual to me when people think of Christians and they think of those negative stereotypes, because to me that's like clearly you realize that's like one in a million. Like that's
Right.
the extreme of the extreme. And so for me being, in that Christian world, like, going to church and living around Christians and socializing with Christians, like that never even,
Yeah.
that stereotype was never before me. It was like, so to me, it's like, it's almost surprising to hear that that's what people actually think. You know what I mean? It's like, that's
Yeah.
such a tiny part of it.
I
And
think
I think
it's
it's
oh
probably the
sorry.
same with a lot. No, like you were saying, it's probably the same with a lot of other belief systems, whether it's political or religious, that the other people out there, you sometimes see that very uh, forward facing, minority that's very vocal, and you think that that represents the whole.
Yeah, and it's like Robert said, that every group has the obnoxious minority, and I think it is kind of the tendency of, I'm not going to say human nature, but it's definitely something prevalent among people to focus on the negative. And I mean that's why, like, oh, like every black person has to be a criminal, right? Like, oh, it's like, oh, like this person's like looking at, they're like looking around for stuff. It's like maybe they're just looking for the aisle that they came to find, but you're gonna have that person who's like, oh, like that's what they're doing. Every, Muslim is, beating their wives because they don't have respect for women, right? Or like
Mm-hmm.
every American's going off like shooting people with their 6 shooters, or, what I mean, like every Japanese person's, killing, like fighting with a samurai sword or something, like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And obviously, like, I'm getting to like the ridiculous at this point, but in many cases, like people do kind of have like those ridiculous stereotypes of the, just like every black person has to be a criminal, or immigrants are like this, or Americans are like that, or, whatever. And so I think it says more to the nature of the person perceiving these like generalities based on that ridiculous minority, than it does about any one group. And I think that that's kind of, I don't know if exemplified is the right word, but it's demonstrated in the fact that this ridiculous stereotype version of groups of people is prevalent among various groups rather than simply like the religious community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. My personal opinion on that is I think it really has to do with the prevalence of media. It has to do with the rise of social media. And it also has to do with the fact that, 20, 30 years ago, there were like 12 channels on cable and maybe 3 of them had news. Now there's like, 10 channels that are 24/7 news all the time. And their marketing strategy has been to, okay, let's target this, let's target the conservative group, and this network over here is going to target the liberal group, and they're going to have the bases that more or less they pander to get eyeballs on their network, because there's just so much there's so many news channels out there. That's how they're differentiating themselves, which is like a sound business decision, right? And then social media, everyone has a megaphone now all of a sudden. And I think a lot of that has allowed for these groups to get together and kind of almost be insulated and have and not really consider the outside opinions of others more than just a derogatory, stereotype. They get together and they crack their jokes about the other people on the other side, whether that's Republicans making cracks about Democrats or Democrats making cracks about Republicans or religion or whatever, and I go on a lot of social sites and I kind of see like the stereotypes out there that people say of Christians, and it does kind of like, I don't want to say it makes me mad, but it's just it's so clear. It's like you do realize like you're talking about like a straw man, like you're not making a compelling
like
argument,
a cartoon Christian, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's really easy to mock a caricature, right? So it's just and that kind of is sad, I think, in the sense that if people aren't savvy, they think that's reality, other than just that caricature for a laugh on a meme or something like that. But I think that's that social media rise and just the prevalence of media out there is kind of why we haven't really given everyone a fair shake sometimes.
Loren is literally such a master of value that I'm like typing little ideas for like future podcast episodes. Cool. So it's like you're talking about like the media element, and it's like it made me think it's like you said, it's a sound business decision to focus on, or as Carl said, media, if it bleeds, it leads. But then there's also like the ethical element of it. It's like, well, like you're not like tons of people are seeing what you're doing, right? So it's like not only are you making money or whatever off of this viewership, but also you are impacting the views of it. And so it is not just a business element anymore. Now it's a social element, an ethical element as well. And I think that's like, I think part of the thing that people like focusing on when it comes to like criticizing religion are, and this is actually something that I think once again is kind of a demonstration of modern viewpoints in general, because people are great at breaking things down these days. Of course, when it comes to like looking at their own thing in the same light, it's not generally so much. But so for example, like someone loves saying, it's like, okay, if the Bible's a holy book, then why have there been like 30 versions that everybody thinks is true? And it's like, you can say that, okay, like this version was manipulated by the state, this version was this version was that. And great, that points out imperfections. But even as someone who is not religious, I'm like, okay, well, that alone would not disprove the value of the original work either, though. So it's like, sometimes, ironically, playing the devil's advocate. I need a drum set in the background. That was a
with that cello back there. Put a little snare drum and a hi-hat. Yeah.
But yeah, I do think that is something that, I guess, because the Bible plays such an important role in faith and in the lessons, and even just, I think, that the worldview that a lot of people for whom like faith is an important thing. I guess, how did you, as someone who is, you're not a dummy, as someone who does think and does like asking the questions, how did you kind of reconcile like I guess the manipulation of religion by people over the years with the original tenets of what it's supposed to be about? So it's like,
Yeah.
for example, like the King James Bible, which just conveniently happens to have, I mean, it's literally the King James Bible. Like it was recreated with the guidance of a political office, versus the original work, as we understand it.
Yeah. So I think that to take it back to kind of the Christian foundational worldview is that we believe mankind is sinful, right? And this world is broken,
Mm.
and everyone in them has sin. There's obviously only been one perfect person who's ever lived, Jesus. And
I was gonna
when
say
you
Loren.
no, oh no, not even close. You're gonna no, that's that no, believe me, I'm definitely a sinner. But when you have that view, it's not surprising sometimes that people will take even the holiest of texts and pervert them in sinful ways.
Like
But I
cherry pick
think
and such.
the reality that mankind has taken something and perverted it, why would that mean that it's not true? I mean, you could say that it's about any philosophy, any political philosophy or economic philosophy, even science, right? Think of social Darwinism. People who took that the idea of science and kind of took that to perverted that to their next level to say, well, let's have social implications from this
Right.
what we believe to be this scientific conclusion. And then that obviously was social. If you're familiar with social Darwinism, is wicked
Right.
and evil, right? So the point is, like, simply because people can take it a wrong direction, like they can do that with anything. Like what truth would you possibly have that is unable to be corrupt? I mean, that's kind of silly, right? To think of where you can go with it. So I
Right.
think that to me has never been a significant barrier to belief. And
Right.
actually, if when you look at the scriptures, I actually taught a class at my church several months ago, just about the reliability of the New Testament. And when you look at the scriptures, what I always like to think about whenever you're approaching any issue that you would think rubs up against faith, you think, oh my gosh, I'm a new Christian, and all of a sudden I hear there's all these versions of the Bible out there, and like what do I believe in? And your tendency is to get you get worried. You're like, oh my gosh, is all this true? There's this huge challenge to my faith. And some people at that point can go a few different directions. Some people will say, hey, just block that out, just have faith and don't look at the reality. I don't think a lot of people do that. I think those are people who are just pursuing comfort and not necessarily truth. The stereotype is that Christians are anti-intellectual, and that's what they do, but that's not really true. Most Christians that I know, and me myself, I go looking for answers. I'm like, well, that's a good point. Well, let me research that. Let me see what truth is out there. And I mean, the truth is out there. There are incredibly intelligent atheists who will look at the facts and say, this leads me to conclude negative things. And there are incredibly intelligent Christians who will look at the facts and say, well, this leads me to conclude things that are positive Christianity. So I think it kind of you kind of have to realize that there's going to be a lot of information out there, and it's not going to be a quick search. You're not going to look at a 5-minute search on Wikipedia and say, okay, now I've mastered this. But to your point just about the Bible, as I researched it, that the New Testament is historically reliable. We have more copies of the New Testament manuscripts than we have of any other work of antiquity ever, and it's not even close. It's like 10 times as much. I mean, I could go back and actually get the data from my presentation when I was reading off the slides and everything, but like it's not even close. When you look at manuscripts that are close to the original material, when you look at the sheer number of manuscripts, if the New Testament is unreliable, then we don't know. Then nothing is reliable about history, because there's so many. Because it was a holy text, right? People would reverence it, and there would be many copies. So that's a good thing.
Right.
And the more copies you get, yes, it is true that there's all these differences between the texts, but the short version of it, and I won't go into like all the deeper version, but when you line up all these different versions, having a lot of manuscripts, you're going to have discrepancies between the manuscripts.
Right.
Like that happened. That's true. Like that's inevitable. That actually, I think, lends to the reliability of it being like a historical document that people like copied, right? Like if every single one was exactly right, an academician in this area would look at that and say, like, that can't be true. Like that's plagiarism. Like that's false. So it actually lends to the reliability that there are these differences in all these manuscripts. And when you look up the thousands and thousands and thousands of manuscripts and you look at the differences, the overwhelming majority of differences are spelling errors or grammatical errors, or they're like obvious copying errors where like a monk, in the 1600s is copying by hand and like skips a line or something like that, So when you take out those, it's just maybe a word here or a word there. There's like very, 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 very few differences that you would say are actually significant differences, and none of them really matter, right? And it all points to it being a reliable document. I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
So you'd say that it's, and I mean, this is obviously something that you would be in a much better position to even be able to analyze than me. So you'd say that even with like the different like agendas and such that like maybe like different like governments and such may have had like throughout the years, even the translations that were done or whatever versions were released under their control, whatever, even under those circumstances, from what you've like seen from your actual research, which is convenient that it's not just an opinion but actual research as well. You'd say that like they weren't doctored in like such a way where it's like basically it was turned into something that it wasn't. Because I definitely think that I think it's kind of irrefutable that religion has been used to control people in a like just plain like, oh, like if you don't do this, then God won't love you, so go and kill that person over there. And really, people did use it in that sense. Of course, to your points, like just because somebody can misuse it doesn't mean that the essence of it is not, is in alignment with that.
I would say that if you're talking about like King James translations or some of these later translations, those are happening. They're translating the original or the original language texts, right? So we have original language texts so that we can trace back the original manuscript from thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. So someone could take that and say, oh, I'm going to translate it, and I'm going to have my political social agenda, and I'm going to translate this word this way and this word this way. But like
you can always check the original.
We have translations now. Like I personally use the English Standard Version, ESV, and it's like a group of scholars who sit around and look at the original or the original translations, the original Greek, the what we know of the original manuscript, not the King James. So it's kind of all these translations they kind of go out the window and everyone goes back to the original, which is pretty much not really refuted, right? Like it's pretty much historically reliable, and there are subtle differences, like maybe one word here or one word here. But even as I'm reading the ESV, it will say at the bottom, it'll have a little note like some manuscripts say this and some manuscripts say this. And it's nothing that changes. It's not like one manuscript's going to say Jesus rose from the dead and one manuscript says he doesn't, right? It's nothing that is in any way substantive.
Came back as a zombie.
It's like very, 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 right? It's very, very, very minor differences that don't really matter to any type of Christian doctrine. So really what we're looking at is it's not people that have changed the text. You talk about people that use religion for power and to control people. They have not changed the text to do so, right? What they've done, and maybe they've changed it, but we could go back further than them and get the unedited, unchanged versions. What the way that people will use religion is by taking this text, but then interpreting it in such a way. Not changing it, but interpreting it in such a way that's saying, okay, this line, right here, we're going to interpret it this way, and then control people that
basis
way.
of authority.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not going to clearly that's been done with every religion that's ever been, right? But to me, that it's just kind of like that is that's not a criticism of the Bible that I have on the app on my phone, because I can just read basically what's based off the the original, what we know, the original manuscripts and everything. So it's kind of
Right.
like, it's kind of a moot point, if that makes sense in my personal faith. It's kind of like how
Yeah.
people have used it in the
Yeah.
past.
It's much like how there's like the stereotype of the Christian, there's also the stereotype of the black guy, or, the cis white male, like et cetera, et cetera. Like there's stereotypes of everything, just as there is a misuse of many different things over time. So it's like, just like working together to solve a problem sounds like a great thing, right? Until you have a bunch of people that think that the only way for the world to move forward is you need to believe exactly what I believe, and if you're not part of our new political system, then you have to be killed so that our it can so it's yeah,
Yeah,
the imperfection of everything.
I think a lot of that too just has to do with the passage of time. Like, it's really easy for us to look back at people 500 years ago and look at how they were stupid and they did this wrong and they did this wrong and they did this wrong. And we assume that, we're right. Like, everything we're doing is perfect. Like, our political system, awesome. Like, our social system, that's great.
500 years later.
Well, yeah. Well, they look back at us and be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe these people got this wrong. They got this wrong. I mean, so I think it is a little bit of that. There was a really good term I heard once for it, but basically the arrogance of the present,
Right.
that we look back judging these cultures, from the past. And the reason I say that is we tend to look at now as like we're enlightened and we're free and like we're making the right decisions and we're doing everything right. Then you look back at 500 years ago and you can say, oh, look at all that religion did wrong. We're right now. I mean, we may look back in 500 years and say that atheism, look how atheism ended up, people used atheism as a means to control, and the bad things they're going to say about whatever beliefs people may hold now. So
Right.
none of that really mattered for me personally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, even just like how people, like the whole group empowerment, I call it a fad, honestly, because it does seem like a fad to me, where it's like, okay, like the people who are within the groups, they obviously see it as a positive, because otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. Just as, I mean, the freaking Nazis saw that what they were doing is positive, right? Like, nobody is thinking about like, oh, like I'm going to do this dastardly thing. But to me, it's like, okay, great. So like you're saying that your group is awesome, this other group is horrible, and you're building up a wall between you and them. And this is supposed to lead to a better world. How? Like, to me, that is the simple thing that I see of the group empowerment that many people see as a positive. So again, to your point, where it's like in 500 years, honestly, probably more like 100 years at this point, because it's like, we're advancing so quickly. I'm waiting for like freaking artificial technology to come out and start asking humans a bunch of questions, and then like nobody has an answer, and like just like one person just breaks it because they can't handle the questions that something that's like not a person would ask. But yeah, like as like Carl said, it's like us versus them is one of the most effective, time-enduring form of control. Memetics. Carl's such a well-read guy. I need to get him on the podcast.
Yeah.
By the way, people are loving your setup.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, Carl said it. Sam actually, Sam Novak. She's
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, I guess you're the value draw.
No, I had a dirty office behind me for so long, and like I did a lot on Zoom, as we all did around COVID. And I was kind of like, man, I actually need to like get a good setup. And I waited like months just because I never had a client that would pay me to clean my office, right? So it just kept being put off, until finally I was like, man, I got to break down and do this. And then I went down like the YouTube rabbit hole, and I was like, let me just look for a good webcam. The next thing that was like, oh, you need lighting and you need this. And I kind of am a little, I don't know, I don't do things halfway sometimes. So I had fun.
Well, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right? And
yeah,
exactly. It's
exactly.
funny because I've had like this, how I come up with these imaginary stories in my mind, and like, me as being a person who's not of faith, and I have like my crappy lighting. And it's like, it's like once you find God, you find deliverance, and also better lighting. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It would just be funny. It's like, I ask you after the episode, it's like, is that like a ring light behind you? It's like, oh no, that's the light of Jesus.
No.
Like,
it's just LEDs and then lights over here. Like nothing.
I'm building a legend.
Supernatural, right? Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So let me ask you a question. Like, sure. Why is it that you're an atheist, or are you an atheist? What do you believe?
Yeah.
Had to
define.
So
the thing for me, and I was thinking about this earlier, where it's like, what is it about what I believe that makes this or that impossible within like what I believe. And I think a big thing for me of why, I'm going to say not why I don't believe in like religious views of things, and more so why it is incompatible, is because for me, existentialism is kind of like, as I see it, like glaringly obvious. To me, the notion that everything is one way, like it's like, oh, this is just how it is. Like to me, it is. To me, that's a childish version. Like I'm not saying it to be like disrespectful. Like that's my experience of it. And so when I think, you know, that there is this one way, and if you don't see things this one way, then you're just wrong. Like to me, it's just like how many different people of different beliefs and different motivations and different ages and different this and different that have had so many just different spectrums of where they came from. And it's like, you have Martin Luther King who, guided people towards great things. And you have, insert however many other, religious people who, led people towards something very not good. And for me, it's like, I believe that people create their own meaning. To me, it's not something you find, it's something that you create yourself, because when you get into the thing, it's like, okay, and this is more of a philosophical thing where it's like, okay, if meaning already exists, then how do we perceive it? And if it is definable, as in meaning exists, there must be a point of showing where meaning does exist and where meaning does not, or where, what in philosophy, like you have to have these ways of showing this is why it is. And again, it's also why philosophy and religion often come to blows, because it's like, philosophy will be like, okay, well, like, where's your model? Why? Whereas like faith-based, I mean, it's in the name, like it's based on faith, right? And for me, like people can believe in anything, right? And the belief itself means nothing. Like people believe that, there were crazy people who thought God told them to kill this person. Doesn't mean it was true, but they believe it. So it's like, for me, I think of all the things that for people who do believe in, well, whatever, but in this case, like religion, for me, a lot of it comes back to the person's experience. And so, for example, like you mentioned before, that faith has guided you through like a lot of very difficult situations. If I'm thinking about that critically, what stands out to me is the belief of it, because there are also many people who've gotten through situations with belief, but believe in themselves, or belief in their community, belief in whatever. And so in that case, it isn't what is believed in so much as that belief was there. And so for me, like the reason why I would say that I'm an atheist in that sense, and I don't even know why I'm doing the quotes. I don't know what, like, I guess it's because I don't know what like the definition of atheist technically is, but is because I just don't see, I see people wanting to create a given meaning from how they perceive something. And for me, there's no reason for me to believe that it isn't just somebody choosing what meaning something has rather than it being there intrinsically, which is also where the existentialism comes from. But at the same time, the thing that I love about it is that because existentialism does not say, you don't believe what I believe, you're illogical, irrational, whatever, and you're wrong. It just says, no, you just don't believe the same thing that I do. And I like being able to come at it from that attitude of not just mutual respect and consideration, but like that even ground. And so for me, it's like, maybe I mean, obviously, as I've already stated, like I don't believe exactly what you believe, but that doesn't mean that I need to disrespect you or think that, you're being irrational about it, et cetera, et cetera. That is your truth. And my truth is different. And we both have our own truths. And to me, that's kind of beautiful in a way, because regardless of why the universe exists, if there is a reason for it existing, et cetera, it does exist, right? And different things exist in different states. And there are billions of other collections of cosmic debris that never led to a situation in which life could develop. And yet, in our case, it is. I don't believe that ours is the only one, but it's just, to me, like seeing the different probabilities of everything and how these things grow in their own right. You know, I think that's why people start to really appreciate nature as time goes on, because you just start to see it. You know what I mean? So that's where I kind of come from with it.
That makes sense. And I think that a lot of people, as I'm listening to you, you kind of had one approach that I see a lot of people take, which is that, and I don't want to mischaracterize what you believe, so correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people have almost this belief that, well, I'm not sure about this religion, I'm not sure about this religion, I'm not sure about this religion, so I'll kind of retreat back to the default of atheism.
That's not the case for me, but
yeah. See, the way I see it, and I'm curious to see if you agree, is that I don't see a lot of people. I'm not saying you're this way. Some people will approach it that atheism is kind of their accepted default, because that's science or whatever they see is like what the default truth is. And so now the burden is on Christianity, the burden of proof, to prove that the Bible is the word of God and that God's real, or the burden is on Islam, the burden is on whatever religion is out there to prove, you've got to prove to me. Well, it's really easy to look at religion and say, well, this, I don't agree with that, or that's a big leap of faith that I can't take, so I'm going to reject that. And then they well, I mean, quite literally, leap of faith. Right. I mean, yeah, it's not a pun. I mean, that's literal, right? I mean, and then
it's still funny.
Yeah. And so then they retreat back to that default where, okay, I'm an atheist, right? Whatever.
Right.
I don't believe that's the way that reality. I don't believe that's not the way I look at the decision. The way I look at the decision is there are multiple paths before you, and you've got to pick one. And atheism is a choice. Atheism is not the default choice that it's on the burden of proof of religion to prove that it's true. And if not, atheism wins. I think you're sitting back with like a blank slate, like, which of these paths do I choose? Which one is right? And in a sense, every religion, every state of or belief in the way things are, kind of almost has that burden of proof to prove that you is true. But there is no like default state, right? What you have to do is you have to look at all those decisions and then make the one that you think is the most compelling and most believable to you.
Right.
And so that was me with Christianity. Is I believe if you were to lay out all these decisions, you take all the major world religions, or you take atheism, you take that there is no God, and you lay out like what are the pros and the cons of each of those positions. Does the world make more sense? Does does this seem like a more compelling, more true path that is more likely to be correct? And that's the thing. I think when you look
existential
at atheism,
question.
Yeah, and when you look at atheism, when you look at Christianity, there are certainly things that require faith. They require you to believe some things that are challenging to believe. I mean, that I've never seen God, right? That I know of, right? So it's that I've never audibly heard a voice. So it does kind of require me to trust some other evidences out there, right? But I think atheism has its own issues that require you to have faith in other things. How the world get here. I think a purely atheistic, naturalistic model requires, quite frankly, a lot of faith to believe that exists. And I do think it is important to talk about. People talk about faith, and they have this idea of blind faith. They have this idea that I'm going to believe just because I believe. That's not really the biblical idea of faith. The biblical definition of faith is more trust. It's trust. It's more like, this is a lame example, but this will hopefully give you a visual illustration. It's like that trust fall. You fall back. I'm sure you see the lame trust falls, right? It's that type of idea. I'm getting ready to go. When I hop in my car and I turn the key, and the engine comes on, like I'm trusting it's going to work, right? It's not like
Yeah.
not necessarily blind faith. The same with a trust fall. Like
Making
it's not,
assumptions. Yeah.
it's not blind faith. I have a reasonable trust, and I think it's that way with Christianity. Some people may come to the conclusion that they have a reasonable trust that naturalism, atheism, is true because
Right.
they see that that is a more compelling path, the path that lines up and is more likely to be correct. So I just think that that's an important distinction to make, because otherwise one may enter the discussion not even processing this and thinking this out loud, but one may enter the discussion that naturalism is true, atheism is true. That's the default truth. And now it's you have the burden of proof to prove Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think if that's the way it's set up, it's that's not, I don't think that's reality. And then Christianity is going to lose, because you're always going to be able to knock it down. It's when you understand I have to choose a path, and and everyone's going to have its problems and what's compelling about it. That's when I think the discussion becomes more realistic and more true to what's really going on. But anyway, I kept interrupting you when you kept trying to chime in. What were you going to say?
No, I mean, you're not really interrupting me if you're just continuing your train of thought. I want to make sure that I'm, and this is something I experience with everybody that I can have like engaging conversations with, is I don't want to lose the thought that something inspired by me during the course of it. And I think the thing for me is, first of all, I do agree that it's like, it should not be, blind faith should not be put solely on the, I'm going to say like the religious hemisphere, because it's like I know that like in this case, like this is more specifically like Judeo-Christian kind of belief relative to atheism, but of course there's also all the other religions as well, right? All the other forms of belief that, we would call, the modern day calls religion, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so in that case, like you're right, it is not fair that, like, for example, somebody can have blind faith in science, but when it's blind faith in whatever else, it's not okay. Like it's hypocritical, right? And I believe that, like, for example, when it comes to like the science, when people say like trust the science, and then like then you hear people talking about like, well, I took this vaccine and like now I have heart problems, never had heart problems in the history of my life. And it's like, again, like it does not prove that, well, this vaccine caused that heart problem. Mm-hmm. But to not even allow that possibility to be in the discussion is blind faith. And I think that's an example of, now granted, that's not just a belief in science, it's also tends to be a social political kind of alignment as well, because people who believe that tend to be of a given political spectrum as well, just as people who thought that it was like this big scam tended to be of a political spectrum as well. But the thing is that I think that the big thing when it comes to, and the funny thing is, like, to me, like, atheism isn't even a belief, it is a lack of belief. So it's interesting just, again, how people see things differently, because I don't see myself as someone who like doesn't believe in God. Like it isn't even as simple as, oh, God or no God. It's okay, which God? You know what I mean? Because it's like at multiple points in history, there are other people who knew that their God or gods were real. Again, like it's belief based. And I think that is where, like you said, where, within a given situation, of course, Christianity is going to lose, because it's literally built in a situation where you need to be able to explain things according to science. So of course, science is going to win when you're talking about the process of scientific, exploration. Like it's kind of a loaded game, but at the same time, the Bible says something is a given way, and people take it, I'm not going to say face value, because there are people who take it at face value. There are people who see it as metaphorical. There are people who see it allegorical, and so on. But at the end of the day, there's no proof of it besides interpretation in that sense. Whereas science can say, oh, this is why this is, and then it can be proven wrong. And so the process of things being proven wrong and something being proven right makes it easier for someone to believe that something is right, because it's true. Like you can't prove that God doesn't exist. Like you can't. Like, what are you going to do? It's like, oh, there's a lot of space over there. right? So it's like, but of course, the same thing, that same intangible experience-based kind of element to it is why it can't just say, because like you could say it's like, okay, well, like the universe is here, like that's proof of it, right? It's like, and then you could also say it's like, well, then if this perfect creator created all this stuff, why is there all this stuff that doesn't seem to serve any purpose? Like there's so much that it's just like back and forth, which is not really like a discussion that I'm trying to like imply in this case, or create. But I think when it comes to the scientific element, again, like people can see, oh, this was proven wrong, but this replaced that. Whereas with religion, like you said, like since everything fundamentally goes back to the original texts and the original experience of it, even just thinking of, for example, say that the prophets and everybody else who, I'm not going to say dictated, but interpreted, the works and, wrote them down. Say that there was something that they just didn't understand that was limited by their human understanding or something like that. But at the end of the day, like, for example, to me, heaven and hell, I see that it more as, and I don't remember the difference between metaphor and allegory, but it's like, I see that as metaphorical. I see that if you live a bad life, like a thing that does not feel true to you, you will live in hell forever. Because to me, living in hell forever is until you die in that sense. Or if you believe in reincarnation, but you don't believe in I'm just going to say religious model of it, but even then it's like incomplete, where it's like, okay, maybe there's a soul, but like there's no judgment, you just keep coming back. Well, if you don't learn your lesson and if you keep doing the same things that are misaligned for you, then you would, in theory, still live in eternal hell. And it's only when you live the right path that you would live in eternal bliss, I think is like what's usually used. But, and so for me, I see that metaphorically. But again, because religion and religious texts, faith-based texts, are not a simple A plus B equals C, I also don't think that it's fair to say that a religious claim is wrong, because what if some of these things were shared in such a way that people who were not as like intellectually, not intellectually developed, but like philosophically and such developed as we are now, so they could experience the essence of it? Maybe, what if heaven and hell weren't actual places that you go to, but by kind of putting in that form, it would guide people along the right path? And I'm not trying to say like, think of it this way, but that's how I look at it. And so I guess to go off of your point, yeah, it isn't fair to expect religion to show proof of why it's right, because it's never going to be able to show scientific proof of it. It's not designed to be that way, right?
Yeah.
But it's also not fair to say that because it can't show proof this way, that's goes with this system, it means that there's no basis to it at all.
Well, I think maybe I didn't present clearly kind of what I'm trying to say, but it's not like that it's unfair to expect Christianity to be reasonable or whatever. It's more of the idea is, if the argument is, whether it's implicit or explicit, if the argument is atheism is true until Christianity or these other religious paths prove me wrong, that's one kind of one way we can set up this decision. Another way is, we don't know what's true. We've got all these paths, and atheism is just another path. I think that's the more realistic option. You see what I'm saying? Where accepting atheism, it's not the default correct state. It's what are the reasons why atheism would be true or not,
I think
versus what are the reasons why Christianity or these other religions would be true or not.
Yeah, to go off of that, to like try to, because I think that like whenever either of us talks for an extended period of time, I think like, yeah, it tends to like some of it tends to get lost in it. So it's like, I think where, as I understand where it comes from, is like, atheism is not saying that there is nothing there. It's not seeing anything there, and so not assuming it. And so of course you don't see bacteria, right? So it's like, that doesn't mean the bacteria is there either, but I think that is where it kind of comes from, is that my understanding of it is that it's like, because like, I'm not going to assume that around the corner there is a bear. If somebody wants to convince me that there's a bear around the corner, it's their job to convince me that the bear's around a corner. Of course, me assuming there is not a bear around the corner is also a choice, like you said. But I
So
think where it comes from is assuming it's like, it is more reasonable from that perspective to assume that there is not a bear around the corner. But of course, then it comes down to, splitting hairs of like, why is it more reasonable to believe there's not a bear around the corner? Because if you're in the forest, it's much more reasonable to believe that there's a bear over there.
yeah. So atheism to you, is atheism the positive affirmation that there is no God?
See, that's the thing though. It's like,
Because that's to me would be the definition of atheism. Whereas agnosticism would be we don't know, right?
see me, and this is something that our buddy, I don't know if I can say buddy, like Stephen George I mentioned, and like he did like a list of like to get people off of his list, I think, or like off his friends list so he could add more people at one point. And he's also a person of faith, and he mentioned that he thought, and I'm going to mention that this is paraphrasing because obviously it's not verbatim, but basically that people who say that they're atheists but not agnostic are being stupid because like obviously there's no way of knowing, right? But to me, everybody should be agnostic. Like if you had a way of, in that sense, whereas to say like, if there was a way of proving to you that like God didn't exist, hopefully one would believe that in that hypothetical situation, you would be able to be like, okay, then I was wrong. Not even connected to what the belief is, right? And so to me, it's kind of stupid to say it's like, oh, well, like if you can't admit that you might be wrong, then it's wrong. It's like, okay, well, but then by that same rationale, then nobody could be truly faith-based because you would theoretically want to be agnostic in that case as well. But to respond to what you said, that was just a tangential thought. To me, again, keep in mind that like as somebody who is, to me, the situation is not God or no God. It is why to believe in a God versus multiple gods, or why a God in this shape versus God is in everything, or that I am God, or that we are all like, there's so many different elements of belief that like, like for example, I think a big reason why it's funny that actually we don't really have a name for it, like the Greek pantheon, but like like we know what Greek pantheon means, but like the reason why I think people don't believe in like Zeus and Aphrodite and all that stuff anymore is because they were so involved in human life in that mythology that it's like, well, once you can kind of see, it's like, okay, well, where are the lightning bolts at? Like you can be like, okay, well then where the hell is Zeus? Like where's the Minotaur? Like where are all these different things? It's easy to prove that the Greek pantheon and such is wrong because it's like, okay, well if they're so involved in people's lives, then we would have seen all this crap by now, right?
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is that there are multiple paths and you're not sure which one is right, and you kind of is that correct?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm going along the path that I see as the most rational for me.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I haven't seen something to suggest to me that this or that path is the valid one. I think is probably the best way to see it. Because I never think of myself as an atheist. If somebody says like, if somebody pushes me on it, I'm like, yeah, like I don't
So
believe
on the path that you're walking down, like, do you think that there's a God or gods? Like, what do you believe about the existence of divinity on this path that you see as more rational?
Yeah, I don't. To me, divinity is, and this is funny because my girlfriend will probably have some interesting things to say. Because the funny thing is like my girlfriend, she's not, and I'm just going to say religious because she would, I don't think she would say that she has no faith, but it's in what she has faith in. She talks a lot about energy and things like that, and the chakras and such, which is funny because it's not funny because of that. But I got a book on it that like even within like Judaism, there was like something like the Sephiroth, like there was like a tree or something like that. I don't remember it specifically, but it's funny how it even kind of tied back to a Judeo-Christian thing because like chakras, it's Indian and such. But I digress. For me, the intangibles, because I, for example, I know that there are things beyond what we can measure simply because I have had precognitive dreams before, useless precognitive dreams, but they were so specific that I know that I perceived something that happened in the future before it happened. Like I remembered an exact scene, an exact image that I saw later on, and that specific scene was only in that state one time that I ever saw it. Like there's never any other situation where that was the case. So Carl's like, speak to your, he was probably talking to me, speak for yourself. I still give sacrifices to Minerva. Fair enough, Carl, you know. But to,
well,
yeah,
question
so
for you, and this quick question for you, because this may bring a little more clarity, but what do you think happens when we die?
So when it comes to death, obviously we know that the physical body dissolves, right? So we know that's the case. The question then is, okay, is there more than the physical body? And for me, it would be kind of ridiculous to not either it's impossible for there to be just the body, or the body would have to have a very specific thing that, again, because it's science-based, we need to be able to prove, because it's only fair that if you're playing a certain game, like you need to be able to play by the rules in that game too. So the body would need to prove that to me, that there's a way of perceiving something outside your eyeballs and your ears and stuff like that. Like there is no physical apparatus on the body that I'm aware of that specifically allows me to perceive something outside the element of time. So I do believe in consciousness, or I think soul would probably be like an acronym in that case. I do believe in consciousness that exists outside of the mechanical body in that sense, because there have been so many situations where like a boy who was like 12 years old, before there was internet, before we had so many different things, could like he knew like the hiding place of like a safe or something like that in another like another village or whatever, that like an old man that had died recently, like he had exactly that guy's memories. And so I do believe in consciousness existing outside the bounds of like a predetermined lifespan. To me, there is in fact too much scientific evidence emerging to just outright discredit that. I mean, there have even been studies where people were like meditating. They had enough people meditating in a given area, and then around them, like the crime rates had gone down during that period. And so to me, I think that if somebody wants to believe in, for example, like the scientific process, you also intrinsically must believe that we do not know everything right now based on what we measure, because like our instruments develop and stuff like that. So I do think that it's going to be interesting to see how this goes, but like as people's understanding of energy develops, how much of that is going to align with earlier like religious faith-based teachings and such. And so, like for example, I had a buddy who I would definitely say fit the raging atheist stereotype, where like to him, like quantum mechanics would essentially just be like religious. It's like, okay, but you can't, if you're science-based, then you need to acknowledge that these studies are being done. Like Einstein, Hawking, like these are scientists. They're not religious people. I mean, actually, I think Einstein was religious, but the point remains is that quantum mechanics, literally, like one of the elements of it is like, okay, well, theoretically, something needs to travel through space to get somewhere, right? No, because this thing can be here and now it's there, or this thing can move now and something in the future is moved at the exact same time. Like there are things that this new science, I mean, it's been around since what, like the 40s or something, but is suggesting improving now more, that just does not align with like the classical model of science. And so I think that it is fair to say that the classical understanding of physics in science is just incorrect or is incomplete. So, and then it's a very roundabout answer, but I do believe in consciousness and beyond the physical body.
So here's what I think, and here's kind of the way I approach even making the decision. of faith, before we talk about which path is right, I think one day we're going to die. And
True.
what is going to happen?
Right.
So I think everyone kind of has to make that decision. Everyone has to confront the reality of death and confront the reality of what could potentially happen to them after they die.
Right.
Is there going to be eternal, a heaven? Is there going to be a hell? How do I get into heaven? What is going to cause me to go to hell? Is it reincarnation? Is it the body's just going to go away and a naturalistic view where you're dead and that's it?
Is there karmic reincarnation where, like, yes, you may not, may not be a heaven or hell, but like if you're a crappy person when you're alive, now you're a worm. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
that's
so
another,
exactly right. So I think that choice is before us, and I don't think we can pass the buck on that. I don't think we can say, you know what, I'm not 100% sure. It might be this. It might be this. I don't really know. Let me just live my life and roll the dice when I die. I don't think we have that choice.
See, I think the thing for me though, it's like there is a decent amount of like evidence that like people have lived multiple lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, like kind of what I mentioned before, and I didn't mean to interrupt you. I don't like people interrupting me, but this is to go off of your thought.
Yeah.
Which is that if reincarnation does happen, then necessarily the model that suggests that it's more of a linear path to heaven and hell would have to be incorrect, unless there was an element of limbo, where like limbo could be kind of a soul coming back. You know what I mean? Because that was something that never aligned with me, is the notion of linear progression. That for me, I saw in Judeo-Christian belief, where it's that, okay, well then where does the soul come from, right? If it has to start from something, that was something that like was always intangible to me, and then it lives, okay, and then it goes to heaven, hell, purgatory. Sorry, not limbo, purgatory. But then what? It's like, to me, like that is like, okay, great. Here's this ending, but then okay, so say that Judgment Day comes then, right? But then what after that? Because Judgment Day always sounds like it's like the end, and then and of course this could just be a limitation of my understanding of the belief and of like the model of it. But I guess to go off of what you're saying is that, to me, not only is there the burden of saying, okay, when you die, that's it, but also if we're seeing more evidence of people having multiple lives, that also, as I understand it, would not disprove, but you know what I mean, like would directly go against the notion of when you die, you go to heaven or hell. So that's how I see it. I do see it as being more indicative of there not being that path of heaven and hell, as I see it.
Yeah. So I think we agree that like you're kind of standing before, you're forced to make a choice, right?
Yes.
And even if you refuse to acknowledge that choice, then you've made your choice by not making a choice, right? So we kind of stand before where life forces us to look out at these competing paths and to say which one of these seems more compelling and why. And I think each path has its pros and its cons. And I think coming at it from that point of view, to go back to what I tried to communicate earlier, to come back to that point of view where we stand where we have to make a decision, right? I don't think you can say you're just an agnostic because you've made your choice to live a certain way, and you may or may not be judged depending on what happens. I think everyone needs to make that choice in their life about which path they're going to see is right and which path they're going to walk down.
Yeah, you have to take into account.
Yeah, whether you make that choice intentionally or just unintentionally by the way you live, because you don't choose to see that you're walking down a path. And you look at all those paths and you just see which one is more compelling. I think you've got to realize that's the decision you're making. So when you're looking at this path or that path or that path, is which path is more compelling. It's not the idea that, oh, I see some problems with this path, so I'm just not going to walk it, because every path would have its potential problems. So to go back to what you were saying a while ago, which I remembered I wanted to comment on this idea of science. If you look back at science, the greatest scientists were Christians. I mean, it was Isaac Newton, Mendel, people like that who had a Christian worldview and who thought, hey, our God is a God of order. Like, we want to understand the world around us because there are these laws that God has put in place that aren't going to change. And it's, we're not going to wake up and everything's kind of shifted. So
what about the Greeks then?
Well,
and the people who were not, like,
well,
I mean, kind of cherry picking in that case, like,
well, people were, I'm not saying that Christianity had the monopoly on science, right? But when we think of a lot of famous scientists, many of them were Christian, right?
Faith-based. Okay, gotcha.
Faith-based, scientists like, Newton, for instance, right? But the idea that Christianity is antithetical to faith, I don't think is, or excuse me, that science is antithetical to faith, I don't think is true. I mean, both can be true. I believe in science, like, who doesn't, right? Like,
right. Apple falls, hits me on the head.
I mean, yeah, like it's, you don't need to prove it. The issue, and here's what I believe the issue is that the definition of science over the last decade, century, whenever it started, has kind of shifted.
Yeah, I would say classical physics is probably misaligned with religion, but not physics and science in general.
Yeah, so exactly, like experimental science, where you understand the way the world works, you can perform an experiment, you can see the results, like that makes, that's science, right? Science began to, several decades ago, almost assume a naturalistic worldview, and then science tried to have a scientific standpoint on things that science really can't speak to, like the beginning of the world, or love, something like that. So what's science is love is just these chemicals or whatever. And so, and the beginning of the world, we have to come up with a naturalistic model of the world. And so all of a sudden, science began to be synonymous with naturalism. And that's where, in terms of the experimental science and science that you can, that you can perform experiments on, and you can see, and the natural laws that you can observe and everything like that, like, of course that's true, like duh. I just think that some people have failed to distinguish that between naturalistic models of how life began, and or how the world began,
right.
Have failed to differentiate that science, and then have tried to paint Christians as uneducated because we're throwing out science or something ridiculous like that. Because
ridiculous situations like creationism too, like, where again you have that minority. And Matt Murphy said, and I don't want to like misinterpret what he's saying, so I'm not going to assume what it means, but he said that science versus faith is a symptom of corrupt religious systems that can't handle new discoveries challenging their power over people. To me, I see it more as like the notion of, and again, I'm not going to, my interpretation of what he said doesn't mean that's what he meant. But to me, it's like, again, it comes back to the notion of, okay, why does it have to be science over religion? Like, people are creating this argument. They're creating the black and white scenario where it is this or it is that. Like, oh, either like God made this or scientific laws. And it's like, even as somebody who doesn't believe in a given view on it, whatever, I'm also not going to, again, straw man something where it's like, okay, well, why, just because laws of physics exist, does that mean that there couldn't be a God? Like, that doesn't disprove anything in that sense. So it sounds to me like that's kind of like what you were talking about, where it's like people are acting like, well, because we can measure this means that religion is false, and that's
exactly. And I think that they just haven't really distinguished the the way I kind of separate into science that is measurable, can be proven, and then science is more theoretical, which is like, how did life begin, how the world began, and things like that. And if you take how the world began from a purely naturalistic worldview, that takes as much faith as a Christian worldview. I think any view of how did the world begin, how did life begin, how did creation, how did the universe begin? I think we're at the point now where every single view requires you to put some faith and trust in it, because nothing lines up where it's like, take it to the bank, this is the easiest thing to prove, right? Everything requires faith. And that's kind of my point, is that every path that you walk down, you're required to accept things by faith. You're required to trust in things that maybe can't be proven. And your choice, your responsibility in this life is to choose to walk down the path that you find, most compelling. For me, I think of like love, right? I think of love and the way that I feel, towards my wife. And it is to simply say that is the result of, chemical processes which originated from evolution. Like, I think that takes some, that rubs up against us. Like, if we're honest, that's like, part of us is kind of like, I think there's just a little more to it than that. Like,
Right.
and I see that's one reason why the Christian worldview to me is compelling. We all in us have this idea of right and wrong. Like, every single one of us would look at murder and rape and stealing from a baby, that's wrong.
Sorry, I just
Right?
imagine taking a
Yeah, well, I
psycho
mean,
maybe it's like,
you
it's
take
just so
exactly.
easy.
Well, you take something like steal or hurting a child, right? An innocent child. Like, we have something in us where everyone would react viscerally to that and get angry at that and say that is evil. And to me, and when you look at something like that, how do you address that based on the path that you're walking down? If you're walking down this purely naturalistic path, you might say, well, that's just evolutionary process where communal living, that all the evolutionary explanations of that. And I'm just like, well, that to me, I don't find that as compelling as the idea that we were made in the image of God, and everyone has a conscience from God, and this universal morality that we all, certain, like attacking a young innocent toddler, like every culture all throughout history, that's wrong. Like, there's no, we just know this intrinsically to be true. And that's where I think it's questions like that, issues like that, when you really think about which path you're walking down, you have to kind of accept every issue. You can't cherry pick.
Right.
You can't cherry pick the issues. Yeah, you can't cherry pick the issues that you're going to choose because they line up very easily with the way your path is going. You've got to kind of accept life as a whole and everything as a whole and say, what is really, going to make sense of this all? And that's why when I've looked at the paths and I've looked at Christianity, it was the most compelling for me.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be rude. I just felt myself losing like the thought that I had going off. So I think that there's a huge difference between knowing that you haven't already proven something and believing that something can't be proven. I think that's a gigantic leap, because to say that something cannot be proven, I wouldn't go so far as to say that. But I would go so far as to say I am not aware of exactly how it would be explained. And I think that also is a decision that people have to make, is to understand, it's like, yeah, maybe you don't know, but just because you don't know also doesn't mean it can't be proven. It just means you can't prove it. In this state of being at this point in time with these measurements or these tools to measure cannot. Well,
exactly. Like we have the burden of making that decision now in our lifetime,
right?
And we have these paths before us, and we have to make the decision in the world that we're in with the information that we have.
Right.
We don't get to say, well, maybe they'll get it at some point in the future, and so let me withhold. Like, no, as I mentioned earlier, you are making a choice. And yeah, that's absolutely true. 100 years from now, 300 years from now, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, who knows what will be proven, what will be unearthed, how it will confirm or deny any of these potential paths that we're walking down. But the reality is, like, we have to make that decision now. We are making that decision now with the way we live today. And that decision is being made based on the information we have available to us today.
And another reflection off the thing of, the thing is that, for example, when you have someone who is, as we describe, a sociopath, they don't have the reactions that you're talking about. You know what I mean? And so that doesn't mean that the trend that you're talking about is not a overwhelmingly accurate one, because it's like, okay, well, you're not 100% accurate, but that also doesn't mean you're not 99 point whatever percent accurate, right? But at the same time, if it were something that was, in that case, like from like a sacred place, so it's like, no, like everybody holds this thing sacred, then from that position, one either has to come up with an explanation for why there would be an exception, or that thing would be proven incorrect. And for me, in this case, like just as like people, as you said, like people will feel bad, it's like, about murder and rape and such like that. Things like that also don't happen because somebody wants to be evil. Like somebody doesn't rape somebody else because they want to be a rapist. They do it because they want something that they can't have, and they decide that they want it anyway, regardless of what it is. Murder, stealing, whatever it is, like these things, for me, and it was another reason why the notion of sin just never aligned with me either. It's that like, okay, so like if an animal kills something because it's hungry, it's just an animal being an animal. But if a person does something, there's like this moral weight to it. It's like, to me, I'd like, okay, but I still see evolution as valid. Like, I don't see this myself as being like Homo sapiens just being created like that. I see the physical thing that is Homo sapien as being a evolution to one extent or another. So to me, it's like, okay, so we're working with brains that have not evolved a whole lot since we were living in caves and hitting this dude with our club because we liked the way his cave woman looked. But we're expecting somebody with that brain to act in a given way. To me, that didn't align. But also the notion of, like, for example, if you think that, for example, even though relatives generally do not mate, unless we're talking about Targaryens from Game of Thrones, like, you still care about people that are related to you, right? But to me, that is a sort of genetic programming, which of course one could also say, okay, where did the genetic programming come from? To me, like, not knowing the answer doesn't imply a given state. I'm not saying you would say that it does. But to me, genetic programming can perfectly explain that. It's like, okay, well, people value the lives of children more than anything else, because if we have no more children, then we have no more people. And fundamentally, all organic life's goal is to continue existing, right? So to have the notion of, well, murder is wrong, also speaks again to humans are social creatures. And so something that would be a threat to social cohesion, a threat to the whole and such, it isn't really, to me, that much of a rational leap that even just genetically we would feel compelled to protect that in that sense. And to me, it also explains why, and I've talked about this with Chrislin before, where it's like, I think that a lot of the disorder stuff is people just being immature, and they just can't accept that, like, oh, this is just like a form of genetic mutation, aka evolution, that didn't work out. So to me, like, a sociopath is nothing but pure hunter's instinct. And obviously that doesn't work so well in a civilization that values consideration of other people, which is why we select against that. So I guess where I'm coming from with this is, there is definitely different ways to look at it, but I think that what makes it so easy for people to fall into simply looking at science and never even asking the question, which I think is one of the most impactful things you've suggested. Is like, okay, you can believe, like, oh, just science, but you need to be making the decision. You can't just say just science, right? I think what makes that so easy for many people is because there are ways to explain it, and people want explanations. That's why people said that, like, when there's a lightning storm, it's because a god was angry, whichever god that might have been at the time. It's like, then we realized, like, no, it's like atmosphere and all this other science crap. So I think for me, it's just as religion, whatever form it takes, is appealing to people in the sense, I believe that they're very understandable stories. I mean, it's stories, right? As copywriters, we know that personal stories are much easier for people to resonate with and learn from than just logic. At the same time, if somebody's looking for like a worldview, it is kind of, in a different way, easy to fall into that simply because, well, they have an explanation for everything. And they know that, like, they knew that this other thing was true, was false, and they're building on it. And so it feels more reliable because it's something that's evolving. They can see that progress versus the simplicity of it. And I do think that's a reason why a lot of people turn away from religion as the path to go down, because it seems too simplistic for somebody that wants an answer to everything, which again, I think says more about the people than the answer itself. But I do think that that is kind of why people tend in the different directions.
Yeah, I think that, what you're kind of describing is that, hey, I look at an issue like familial relationships, and it seems a more compelling explanation is, to walk down this path. I would think you should read Francis Schaeffer.
Sure.
And Francis Schaeffer, he's a famous, Christian apologist, and
Okay.
it's all about, I think deep within us, we have a search for meaning, right? Like we have a search, we know that something else,
We have to know.
have this idea that something else, it just doesn't seem like this is all that there is, right? That this life is all that there is. There's within us, there's kind of this desire for something more. And that could be interpreted a million different ways. Like the same with love. Like, how do you interpret that?
Right.
How do you interpret this morality? And you could say, well, it is evolution in us because we're social creatures and we were conditioned that way. I mean, that is one, that's one conceivable explanation, right? I would walk down another path where I think that is, morality in us, a conscience from God. You address issues like the fact that all of us really have this desire for meaning. All of us want to live live a life of purpose. Even explicit and hard-nosed atheists want to live a life of purpose. And particularly, in the millennial, I guess it's kind of the stereotype, where they want to have a job where it's about the why, right? It's about like they want to live a life of purpose. Now, why is that? Well,
why? Sorry.
yeah, like why do we want to why do we all have that desire for purpose and that desire for meaning and that desire for legacy? And I think that I'm not there yet, but I've heard that when you're 60, 70, 80, that is just even more amplified. Who knows? But like, why do we have that? And there are various explanations. You could just say, I mean, whatever naturalistic, I'm not familiar with naturalistic explanations for that, or this explanation or this explanation. And mine would be that, God has put a little piece of eternity into our heart, and we know that there's something else out there. And I think when you confront all of life's issues, all of life's questions, which model makes sense? When you confront the reality that, Jesus lived, right? When you confront the historical accounts, when you look at the history of the church, right? The early church that grew, and all the apostles said that they saw Jesus raised from the dead, and they were all of them martyred except for John, who was exiled. They all lived, and 11 of the 12, died for their faith. Then that points to, perhaps a certain path being right. So I think when you look at all of the issues, you have to choose, a path to walk down. For me, the one that makes the most sense is Christianity, and it may have kind of started and have certainly been augmented by just that personal feeling and the personal relationship. But I do think it's a mischaracterization to say that's all it's about.
Yeah.
That for me is just kind of a confirmation of the path, but really the path to me is reasonable and is logical.
And the fact that it comes back to the whole thing of like, even what I described could be true, not exclusive of what you've also said, where it's like, okay, it doesn't feel like love is just a chemical, because again, like it goes back to like what you said before, where it's like, okay, well, why does it have to be science or religion? Like people are creating these one track pathways, like just as there's hybrid ecom pages, there's hybrid, belief systems. Of course,
Mhm.
like where marketers are, there have to be, it has to come back to some of those examples. But
Yeah.
so even for example, like to the model that I described could also exist simultaneously, even with, for example, some of the notions of just like the energy kind of, I'm not going to say philosophy, but belief, where it's like, conscious, like sometimes like people feel like this connection to another person that they know in their life, whether it's a spouse or a best friend, whatever. And you just felt like the moment you met this person, like you weren't meeting for them for the first time. It was like you were seeing them after a long time.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of, and of course, like you could just explain it away and like the sense of like people are attaching meaning to it after the fact. But I think that it's like, it does resonate with me that at the very least that, again, like I said, that the consciousness exists outside of the physical apparatus, right? And that like the soul, whatever you want to call it, could come back multiple times. And that would explain, again, why people could know where like a safe that nobody else knew was, like back when there was no technology, no way to share this information, no, great scam to play. It could explain why like people will meet in kindergarten, as I have with my best friend who's coming on next Tuesday. And it's like it just looks, it's like this is like year like 321, not day one, you know?
Mm. Mhm.
Um, and the thing is like, yeah, the genetic programming could be true, and yet that could also be true. And so, like, for example, love, like quantum mechanics, like a lot of it talks about vibrations and such, which is where a lot of energy comes from, which is like the giving off of whether it's radiation or whatever else of different frequencies and such like that. And that's kind of where the belief blends with the science there, being able to measure the spectrums. Well, even in that belief, uh, well, viewpoint, whatever, love vibrates from a higher vibration. So
Mhm.
even if it wasn't like, oh, like people were given the gift of love, it still would not prove that love is just a chemical, because then you would still need to disprove, okay, but then what about everything quantum mechanics is talking about, where like love vibrates at a higher level? So I do think that the classical understanding of physics and science, I think that it is easy to say that is incomplete.
Mm.
Which, I mean, you could also say that means it's wrong in a certain sense. I mean, it operates at a fundamental level, I guess. But I think for me, like that is a big part of it. Is like, I think the more we understand about quantum mechanics, the more we're going to understand that things can be beyond whatever the belief system was, and that there is an explanation for something that can be both science based and religious based, or faith based, or whatever you want to call it, energy based, intangible. Um, and for me, I don't believe in something non-scientifical. I do believe that science goes a hell of a lot farther, I guess pun kind of intended, than many people are willing to consider. Because if I can affect something in the future right now, that doesn't really align with classical physics. You know what I mean? And so,
Mhm.
and yet there is the developing field of science that is disproving that. And I think that philosophically, people will have to look at their chosen paths differently as well, because, like, again, you don't have to believe that you're going to heaven or hell to believe that the decisions and actions you make and take in this life can affect a future life. So, regardless, it's taking it, ironically, a whole lot of faith to
Mm.
believe in you're just done, you're just one and done, you know?
I mean, exactly. Yeah. No, I think it is a lot of faith and trust. I mean, every path that you're going to walk down, you're going to have certain aspects where you just have to have faith, certain trust in the incomplete model. You know, the answers that aren't readily available, and that's true of every path.
Right.
So that's why I've never found criticizing the fact that, you need faith, whatever, to believe in Christianity. I think that's just people who have never really examined. It was kind of I had a friend in college tell me that he thought Christianity was absurd because it didn't make sense to him how God always existed, and so Christianity couldn't be true because that just was wild. And I can understand that point of view at first, right?
Where it came from with it, yeah.
Because it's like, okay, you're right. Like that is kind of wild. But then you think about, well, so how did the world start? And when you think about it, like either something was always there, whether that's a supreme being or primordial ball of matter or energy, whatever, either something was always there or something came from nothing.
Or like we could be going through a cycle. Like that's another thing of thinking of like the universe is expanding now, right? But then
then where did it start though? But I mean, so my point, there had to have been some origin to even that cycle.
If so there is logically, no origin, yeah.
Well, but then that's the thing. There's only two choices. Something was always there, or something.
I see what you mean.
Like those are the only logical two choices, and both of those are absurd. My point is like there's no model to the beginning of the universe that is anything but absurd, right? The fact that God always existed, like that's wild to me. Like I can't wrap my tiny little human mind around that, but I can't wrap my tiny little human mind around any potential theory for the beginning of it. All of them are equally as mind-blowing. So I think that's where, to go back into the way wrap it all together from where we came a long while ago, was many people I think approach Christianity as, hey, I don't believe in this, therefore the default is there's no God. When I think you've got to kind of say, that's not the way, that's not the path before me. That's not the choices that I have. I have to pick a path. And and whatever path I pick is going to have something absurd about it, something illogical about it, some areas that I'm going to be required to have faith in. And it's just, of all the different paths, which one are you going to pick that is that's the most compelling and you think requires the least amount of blind faith and is the most compelling, most logical answer, most rational, where everything kind of fits together.
Yeah. And I guess because I know we've been talking for a long time, so I do want to respect your time, but I have two more things I wanted to mention. And the first one is off of what Carl said. It's, you never find an atheist in a firefight. When you're dying or under threat dying, you look for meaning, you look for purpose. Nobody wants to believe the fire their soul is extinguished when they close their eyes to this world or something like that. I also don't think that, I do think that when people are inherently faith-based, they forget that you can, and I'm obviously saying faith-based in the religious context, like as we've no doubt proven by now, everybody is faith-based to some extent. You know what I mean? But I also think it is too black and white of a stretch to assume, and I'm not saying you're saying this just to go off of what Carl was saying, that just because you may not believe in a heaven or hell or a God does not mean that you believe in nothing. Again, it is not a all or nothing thing. And I think that's kind of something that we're getting at, is that it is a matter of choice, and it doesn't have to be this or that. It can be a combination of the things where we don't even know where one ends and the other begins. And I think a big part of it is, like you said, which is why faith is required, is because we do not know everything, and we will never know everything, or likely we'll never know everything. It's so, to me, as someone who would be described as an atheist, it's like, okay, well, it's not that I don't feel a sense of meaning. I don't believe somebody else gave me that sense of meaning. I don't believe that everything ends with just being a sack of meat and bones, but that also does not mean that I need to believe in X, which I think is something that, just as there's the extreme of, religious people are all just a bunch of idiots who just mama told me this, so I believe it. Like that's ridiculous. That's cartoonish. It's also kind of cartoonish to believe that like an atheist is just somebody who believes in nothing because they don't believe in this. So what does this person believe in? Whatever. That's why I'm existential, or actually have my own kind of view that we definitely don't have enough time to talk about. But it's where people create their meaning in that sense, because it is like the path, like you're choosing your story, right? You're choosing the model you believe in, the universe, the meaning, the etc. And that's why being existential in that sense of like where you create your own meaning makes the most sense for me, because there can be this. and there can be this, and there can be that, and nothing has to change. Like, and that's what I like about it, is like things can just be as they are. But then the second thing that I wanted to mention, and this is, this was always just something that bothered me when people tried, when they asked me like why, for example, I didn't believe in things as the Bible taught it, or like the model of it. One example of it was the story of Adam and Eve. That thing always bothered me because, as I understand it, God's all-knowing, all-powerful, exists right now and in the future at the same time. Like there are no bounds, right? Creates Adam, creates Eve from Adam's rib. Eve and Adam are, they're living it up in Eden, and God said that you can go wherever you want, you can do whatever you want, just don't eat the fruit from this tree. Eve is misled eventually by the serpent, who convinces her to eat from the tree. She eats from the tree. She gets Adam to eat from the tree as well. God punishes them for the sin, and that's what is it? Cardinal sin? Is it?
The fall you're talking about?
The fall, yeah, but I thought that was like the fundamental sin of everything that like all humans are born with. From the model,
You're talking about original sin?
Original sin, sorry.
That's a little different,
original,
but I see
what
you're saying though. I see what you're saying though. Yeah.
Yeah. So what always bothered me about that was God created everything. God knows everything. God is in the future as well. Is that an assertion? Because I'm not trying to straw man it. Mm-hmm. Okay. If this is all the case, and if people have free will, then creating this person, you knew what they were going to do. Creating this tree, you knew it was going to be eaten from. Creating this serpent, you knew the advice it was going to give. The serpent, depending on the interpretation, the serpent mm-hmm. is just a serpent, or the serpent is Satan. But you knew what this was going to do too. And like, I'm not even going to go into that because this is one example. And so essentially, if you create these things and you can see in the future, then it would be on God for creating all this stuff in a way that could be in the case in the first place. Because if you knew that if you create this tree and this fruit, and you create this woman, just because like the basis of it, Adam did it too, and you create this serpent or angel who becomes corrupted, then you know what it's all going to lead to. Mm-hmm. And so how is it fair to judge these things that you created and you knew what they were going to do for doing what you as an all-powerful, all-knowing being allowed them to do? Like, there's the element of free will, but I feel like that's separate from this. The thing that I'm focusing on is punishing something mm-hmm. for doing something that you knew it was going to do before you created this thing, and when you could have changed it to begin with. That was something that always bothered me, and I'd mm-hmm. like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, and I can understand how that rubs up against you the wrong way, because part of having any worldview, whatever path you walk down, there are going to be things that, if you have a Christian worldview, for instance, take that path, where things might not line up with the worldview of the world around us. Okay. And it may require us to look at things a certain way that maybe isn't inherently natural for us. Now, to go back to the Christian worldview, I mean, we're all sinful, right? We have a sinful worldview. So the fact that we don't see everything as perfect and natural and wonderful as it is not necessarily a conflict, right? That would kind of be in line with the Christian worldview. But think about this. When people think about God, put yourself in the mind of a Christian, okay? When people think about Jesus, when they think about the Christian God, what are some of the wonderful things about him that a Christian would say is praiseworthy?
That you had compassion for people even when they were abusive towards you, or intolerant of you.
Exact. So grace, mercy,
Right.
And I mean, look, like right up here, right? Like that's pretty much the symbol of the Christian faith. You know, what is the cross other than Jesus dying for our sins? Now, how are you going to know that God is gracious, that he's a God of grace? How are you going to know he's a God of mercy? How are you going to know that he's a God who loves you enough to send his son to die for you? That Jesus loves you enough to hang on the cross willingly. He could have snapped his fingers and evaporated the world and gone up to heaven and said, peace out, but he didn't. He died on the cross for every single one of us. How are you going to know that God loves you enough to do that? Jesus loves you enough to do that if there is no sin?
But how can there be sin when it's all creation of something that would have known that it would happen to begin with?
Well, and I'll get there, right? So that's the point. Is
Gotcha.
like how part of what God is accomplishing on earth is just displaying his manifold qualities that are amazing. So from the very beginning, if all we had was the garden, which would have been awesome, right? In its own right, we would have praised God's creative power. We would have praised his providing power. You know, the fact that we could be relational and walk with him in the cool of the day. But we would have never praised his love to the extent that we can because sin existed. We would have never praised his grace, his mercy. We would have never even praised his wrath, because the Bible does describe God as a God of justice, a God who hates sin, and a God who is wrathful against those who hate him. We would have never even understood those aspects of God. I've heard God described, it's like a diamond, where, you know, you take this amazing diamond and you turn it around, and there's all these different facets, all these different sides to the diamond, and just one perspective on it, it's still amazing, but it's even more amazing when you can twist it around and you can see every nuance, every facet of that diamond. It's the same with God and his character traits. Because we can see the multifaceted approach of how God is amazing, that is where we can he becomes truly praiseworthy in a way that he couldn't have been if we couldn't perceive all those facets.
Why does he need praise? If it's all part, like, that seems really egotistical to me.
Exactly. It does, doesn't it? And see, that's where part of it goes back to this Christian worldview. We as Christians believe that God is the greatest joy that there is, right? We were created to enjoy him. So God giving us more of him is the most loving thing he can do, right? If I were to say, praise me because I'm amazing, that would be egotistical, because I'm a sinful man. It's not for God.
And why is that an exception then?
Well, there's
created of it.
Well, go look up. You can go to YouTube and look up, John Piper. He gave a talk at Google, like, is God egotistical or something to that effect. John Piper, Piper. He gave a talk at Google. You can go Google that and check that out, and he can explain it much better than I can. But the idea is that God, it is unique in that God is the only being on earth, the only being that there is, that sharing how wonderful he is actually loving, right? Sharing, getting praise is actually the most loving thing he can do, because the most loving thing he can do is share the greatest thing on in existence with me, which is himself. And that rubs up against our kind of worldview. And that's where you've got to kind of understand the Christian worldview and kind of understand, okay, here's what the Bible says. And it takes a little bit of maybe undoing or unthinking some of just our natural inclination to hate arrogance, and realizing how that's different for God, which is why I would encourage you. I don't have the time or the expertise or the intelligence to do it
well
well here.
But you don't need all answers at one time.
But go check out that talk by John Piper. Well, he can explain it much more deeply and better than I can. But the idea is, yes, that the most loving thing that God can do is to show himself in all of his manifest glory, all of the different facets of what makes him wonderful. The most loving thing he can do is show that to us, which is why actually sin existing is taken as a whole a good thing, because it allows us to see sides of God and revel and love and enjoy sides of God and aspects of God that we wouldn't otherwise enjoy. So, and God has go ahead.
Brighter light with the shadow. Like, you can't properly appreciate the light without there also being shadow, because otherwise there's no contrast. kind of that idea in the sense of like
I mean,
there's
possibly. Like, I wouldn't necessarily put it exactly like that, but yeah, the idea is that
right. It's simple.
Sin allows us to see character traits of God that we
Right.
wouldn't see otherwise. And the idea then is, okay, well, what about these poor people who have been created and God knew it would happen? And that's where it goes back to the fact that these people are culpable. God created everything in such a way that they had the chance. You know, Adam and Eve had the chance, and they didn't.
But
You know,
did they really have a chance? Which I guess is like where my question ultimately goes back to, because
Mhm.
is there a chance when the person who's creating the scenario knows exactly what's going to happen? Because wouldn't it be on him to stop it from happening if he knew it could happen? Why not create things in such a way, because he is all powerful and all knowing,
Mm.
before these things were even created, he should have created them to be incapable of doing, like, why would you even bother creating a tree? Like, it does kind of sound like you're just screwing with people. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
here's this thing, but like, you can't eat that. Like, why
Well,
even create temptation in the first place? And why hold them responsible when you are the one creating the situation in the first place? Like, if you have a 4-year-old and you just put a bunch of desserts on the table
mm-hmm.
and you say, I'm going to work now, don't eat this. I mean, or like put a bunch of meat on the table for a dog, whatever it is, it basically sounds like the person who should have all the wisdom and all the power is literally setting up this other party for failure. And under those circumstances, again, I know this is probably going to be an element of like the Christian worldview versus the other worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this party, first of all, why are they responsible in the first place when this other more powerful party created this scenario? And second, why is only this thing uh, culpable? And third, if this thing is culpable, since it came from this, does that not also intrinsically imply that this thing also has that imperfection in that case?
Well, to your example of the 4-year-old, right? And I have 3 kids, so I can think of plenty of
You can
stories of
relate.
them. Yeah, I have plenty of stories of
Got the
them
beard, like you could
being,
like, yeah.
yeah, exactly, being disobedient to me, or little kids, right? But if I were to have, a bunch of candy on the table and tell the kid don't eat that, and then I were to leave him alone, and he were to have the opportunity to have some, does that mean that he's not doing wrong by eating it? No. Like,
Correct.
he's accountable. Like,
Right.
he could have chosen to obey and to do what was right and to follow the desires of me, right, his father in that case.
But in
But
this case, what about you? Yeah.
he didn't, right?
But
So
I
it's the
mean,
same. It's the same with
right.
God. Well, what it really gets to is like, mankind is you're ultimately accountable for sin,
Yeah,
right?
I agree with being responsible for what you do.
You're ultimately accountable. So Adam and Eve were the ones who were ultimately accountable. I don't, in the Christian worldview, saying that, well, God could have stopped it or he could have done this, so he's responsible. I know that's not really in line with, I think, the Christian worldview, and saying that God is responsible. Now, I understand that rubs up against many of the ways that the world would look like it would look at that, but no, the Christian worldview is that God is love, God is perfect, and he created the garden to be perfect. He
Mm.
created Adam and Eve with the potential to sin, but not the inevitability to sin.
But isn't it inevitable since he can see in the future and he knows it's going to happen?
Well, I mean, no, they had the choice. I mean,
But I mean, he created
simply
them.
because he saw, yeah, well, simply because he created them with the capacity to choose, and they chose evil, does not make him culpable for the fact that they chose.
But
He
he
just
also,
created them with the capacity to choose.
but then why create them with the capacity to choose evil? Why create evil to be chosen?
Well, that's a good point. And what God created the world in such a way that sin would exist without him causing it, without him encouraging it, without him condoning it. But he just created the world in such a way that it could exist. Created the world in such a way that those who chose sin were accountable, were to blame for their sinful actions. Created a world where God, told them this is sin, don't do this. Gave them every possible encouragement and reason not to sin. But yet created the world in such a way where, yes, it was possible so that he is without sin. God doesn't encourage sin. God does not lead us to sin, but created the world where sin is possible. But that's also the world where, God has no blame on his hands, right? He doesn't have bloody hands, so to say. He doesn't have any guilt. He doesn't have, he did not participate in evil. He didn't cause evil. He didn't create evil. But on the other hand, there is that good of now, as I mentioned before, we can enjoy other sides of God and understand things that we previously couldn't understand. And there is a net beauty in the world because of the existence of sin, which he did not cause, but he set up the world in such a way that that could be chosen for the net good of us seeing and enjoying him and the world understanding who he really is. And I know that's really, that confront, I mean, that is,
it's that
hard
path
to wrap. I'm sorry.
It's that path, which is, again, like it's ultimately why, like there doesn't need to be, and that is a thing that I think is important for people to consider when they're talking about something that they don't need to, maybe they're not going to change their mind on, and they're not going to choose a different path, because it's like, okay, to me, none of that changes anything, because if in the beginning there was the word, right? If following from that, literally everything that comes thereafter comes from the word. And to me, it is a violation of what is already put forth to say that in the beginning there is only the word and everything else comes from the word, except for sin. To me, that is just, it's a deus ex machina. It's just not, it's just irrational to me. It doesn't mean that it needs to be the case for you. Just because it's the case for you doesn't mean it needs to be the case for me. To me, the fact that he created these possibilities, being all powerful, being all knowing in this scenario, to me, that does make him have responsibility, because for you, and of course, for example, like, to me, like, for example, that you would have the candy there to begin with does make you responsible, because you know how kids think. You have the wisdom and experience to know that, and being a kid in the past, you know what's probably going to happen. You don't know that it's going to happen, but by having wisdom to know that it could happen and creating it anyway, to me, there is an element of responsibility, which is, like, in my view. And again, this isn't me trying to poke holes in your path.
No, I'll tell you a story.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a story. This is a true story, and this is the way I've kind of explained some things in the past, but a little different from this. When I was a new father, my kid was probably about a year old.
Okay.
And he was crawling around, and we lived in a different place where our kitchen had like tile, and everything else had, like the living area had carpet. So our rule was he didn't go on the tile, because that way he didn't get into the kitchen. He wasn't around knives and, chemicals and everything else like that, whatever. Right. We were cooking, right? So he'd be safe, right? So don't go on the tile. That was the rule. And he was a smart little kid. It took him like, he would walk up and he'd put his hand on the tile and be like, and he would look at me, and then he literally took one finger and put it on the tile. And I'm like, and then you
could see the gears turn.
But it wasn't like, it wasn't like he was defiant. It was like he was trying to understand it, because we weren't talking at this point. He was that little. So he was like, oh, okay. He got it, and he was fine. He understood it. And he understood that rule. He would play by the carpet and go all around and not touch the tile. Play, not touch the tile. Well, one day, out of the corner of my eye, I see him drop a little toy in the tile, and he crawls in there, and he gets the toy, and he comes back. And I really didn't do anything, because I'm like, well, he just dropped a toy. He took like 2, steps or whatever, crawling, and came back in, like, no big deal. Just don't, hope he doesn't do it again or whatever. And then literally, like, the next day I saw him.
Give him an inch, they take a mile.
He took a toy, chucked it, his little baby throw like that, chucked it in the kitchen, crawled in there, got it, and came back out. And I'm like, oh, smack. Like, I'm going to get him now, right? So I waited on him. I was kind of hiding where he couldn't directly see me. And I saw him, right? He chucked that toy, and he chucked in the middle of the kitchen. And then he starts crawling in there, and I snuck up on him and waited to him to get right in the middle of the kitchen. And then I was like, and he started crying immediately, because he knew he was busted, and he was really sensitive like that. Now, here's some lessons in that. Okay. What was important? Was it important? Why did I let him go? Why did I let him go into the kitchen? Right? Like I could have stopped him.
The first time, yeah. Like if it was an accident and he
If
was
if
just getting it
I
right.
if I really wanted him not to go into the kitchen, I could have built a brick wall right there. We could have chained him in another room, right? Like there's plenty of things I could have done to keep him out of the kitchen if that was the most important thing to me. And when I saw him chuck it in there and he came back out and he got it and he was getting ready to chuck it again,
Now
I'm
there's
not all
intent.
I'm not all knowing like God. I'm not all wise. I don't see everything that God sees. But at this point, I was like 30 and he was like a baby. So it's like,
You
I'm
saw
smart.
everything.
I saw his little baby wheels turning in his brain. Like, I know what's getting ready to happen. Like, I'm not all knowing, but I knew this. And I'm not omnipotent, but I could have snatched him up right there and say, no, don't go into the kitchen. Right. I'm not all powerful, but I'm 30. He's a baby. Right. I could have done what I wanted to, but I let him go in there. Why? And I did it because the most important thing in the world to me the most important thing at that point was not to keep him out of the kitchen. The most important thing was to teach him a lesson.
Okay.
So that's why I let him get all the way into the kitchen. And then I made my presence revealed to him and said, right? Because
It
I
is a good story. It's a good,
I
good
wanted,
metaphor.
I wanted to teach him a lesson. So on the one sense, you could say that my desire for my kid was not to go in the kitchen. And that's true. Right? Thus saith me as a dad, don't go in the kitchen. But in another sense, I allowed him to do that. And I allowed him to do it because I had a greater goal in mind, not just keeping him out of the kitchen. I knew he wasn't in any danger at this point because there were, no one was cooking. I knew it was okay. I was keeping an eye on him. My goal for him at that point, I had a greater goal, was to continue to discipline him and teach him not to go into the kitchen and teach him to listen to his mom and dad. Now it's the same with God, right? Could God have stopped sin? Absolutely. Could God have created us where there was perfection the entire time around and sin never existed? Yes, but he had a greater goal in mind. He allowed mankind to sin. He didn't create it. He didn't condone it. He didn't create it. He didn't cause it. He created a situation where it was possible and he allowed it to happen so that two things could be true simultaneously, that just like my kid was the one to blame for going in there, not me as a dad, he was to blame for going in the kitchen. So too mankind is to blame for sinning, but God has that greater goal in mind of revealing the reality of who he is to us in all of his wonder and glory. Just like I had the greater goal of disciplining my kid and teaching him greater lessons than just staying out of the kitchen, God had that greater goal, right? And I know that's a lot to wrap your mind around. So I would encourage you,
I get it.
go check out. And this is the thing, like, I think sometimes we just throw up a blanket objection, say, nope. And we continue on our path. I would encourage you, if this is something you're really curious about, or if you're potentially, if this is really rubbing up against you, if this is someone says, if you really have a stone in your shoe on this, research that, go look into it. I've done this in the past where something didn't sit right with me and I would go looking for information. I would go looking for the truth, not for comfort, not for the first thing that agreed with me that I said, okay, I'm right after all, but I would go looking for people who argued against me and people who argued for me and then against them and against them and against them, back and forth till I kind of arrived at what I believe to be the truth. So I would encourage that to you, or to, anyone, anyone listening to this, because when I look at all of the paths available, and when I look at reality and I look and I see a historical man that lived, and I see a historical man that fulfilled prophecies from the Old Testament it was uncanny that he fulfilled them the way he did. I see the evidence of this historical church all pointing to the fact that Jesus lived, and that Jesus was a real person who died, and that Jesus was a real person who was raised from the dead. Now you combine that with the fact that just testifying in my own soul is the fact that I know certain things are right deep down. I know certain things are wrong. I have deep down a search for meaning. Deep down, there are questions that I ask myself that can't be answered by naturalism. Deep down, there are issues that I have within me that points to the reality that there was a God who created everything, perfect. There was something that has been broken. There is something wrong with the world now, which is sin. And I look at myself and I say that, I'm seeing my sin. I'm looking at myself and I'm realizing things that I have done that I would testify to the fact that they're wrong. Not other people telling me, look at this book telling you you're wrong. Like, I know deep down they're wrong. and it corresponds with what I see in these books, right? This book that tells me that what I'm doing is wrong, so that I know, like, hey, God would be blameless if he sent me to hell because I deserve it, because I've sinned. But I also see part of this reality that, Jesus died, that this real man who lived a perfect life and died a death that he didn't deserve and was raised to life, proving his divinity. The reason all of that happened was so that he could take my sins. And when I see that path, all of a sudden that becomes so true to me and so beautiful and so glorious that it is a path I feel comfortable and confident walking down, and I'll put my trust in, not blindly, but because that is the reality that makes sense to me, and all the evidence that I see points to that. So people, you listen to this, people listen to this now, if they want to chat, like, hit me up. Like, I'm always happy to open if they have questions. I'm not saying I'm the smartest person on earth, but I believe the answers are out there. So we can find the answer together, or I can point you to places where you can find the answer from much smarter people, because I was just reading from the Bible this morning, and part of the beauty of God is how he comes to us. We don't have to climb up a mountain and find a God who is aloof, sitting up there. We have a God who reaches down to us, who sends us, testimony in our heart where we know there's meaning. We know there's something out there. We know we've got a gap that we need to fill. He sends us the scriptures. He sends us people to tell the truth. He sends his spirit to just work among us to where, maybe all of these things rubbing up where maybe stones are in your shoe, maybe that's God in a sense beginning to work there. So anyway, that's my long spiel for the day. So,
and I mean, I think that what I'm grateful for, which is kind of goes in amusingly in line with the comparison between the Garden of Eden situation and the child, the oh man, I'm a copywriter, so I'm like trying to come up with like the Garden of Kitchen, you know what I mean, like the Kitchen of Eden situation.
Yeah.
Even though for like what I am grateful for the most is that I don't see it that way, and that to me, I see it as like a kid wanted something, like something wanted something, and it didn't really care that it wasn't allowed to do it. It just didn't do it because it was scared to do it. And yet, despite us seeing many things so differently, we could have a considerate, respectful, and like like just poking holes in this or that kind of conversation for almost 2.5 hours.
Is it that long? Oh goodness.
Yeah, I kept looking at it
talking.
like, I didn't mean to take up so much of your time, but it's like, I think that is what I value the most. And that's what the whole element of the Outcast Intellectual Podcast is all about. It's like, it's not about saying the things that people don't want to hear and just like sticking it to them or whatever. Like, sometimes there's a little bit of that to it, but I mean, it ultimately comes back to being able to talk about the things that many are not talking about in a way that many are not talking about it. And yeah, I appreciate you giving me.
That was fun.
Cool.
Awesome.
See you later, guys.
Have a good one, man.